Hello and welcome to another episode of Boundless Body Radio. I'm your host, Casey Ruff, and today we are introducing a new and special format that I am super excited for. Dr. Nick Norwitz is a returning guest on our show. He was the valedictorian at Dartmouth, got his PhD at Oxford in 2 years, and is now attending Harvard Medical School. He has leveraged a low-carbohydrate diet to help him resolve his osteoporosis, skin, and gut issues. He is the co-author of the new Mediterranean cookbook, which was just released. Our next guest, Dave Feldman, is a senior software engineer, entrepreneur, and a citizen scientist. After learning about low-carbohydrate diets to help his weight and energy levels, he began researching cholesterol and its roles in the body. He is now considered to be a world expert on the topic after years of studying and testing. He has even developed the Feldman protocol. You can find Dave's work at cholesterolcode.com. Gentlemen, it's an absolute honor. Welcome to Boundless Body Radio.
Thanks, Casey. Super excited to be here. Speaking with Dave is always a pleasure. And, you know, for people who don't know Dave, I think maybe a lot of the listeners might, but Dave is one of these people. Like, I've been bouncing around these cool institutions, meeting Nobel laureates and, you know, world-renowned doctors. And honestly, I think Dave deserves like a triple doctorate just for what he's done. He's one of these people that doctors actually do gravitate to, even cardiologists, to ask him questions about what's going on. He's one of these people that came in, he's an engineer, but came in to kind of look at the field in a different way and is just turning it on its head. And now starting to generate some real clinical data. So hopefully this conversation will be interesting. And I do think Dave deserves some, biomedical credentials of a sort. I don't want to cheapen this conversation at all. I think he's one of the most remarkable people in the space. Now that he's probably blushing like a tomato, I'll let you say hi, and then I'll frame, I think, what we're going to talk about for most of this conversation.
Awesome. Thanks, Nick. Welcome, Dave.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much. And the super, super kind words, Nick. No question. I often like to say I kind of came in from a side door in a way, doing something like self-directed learning as opposed to formal training has lots of pros, but also has lots of cons. There's definitely lots of gaps in my knowledge that I wouldn't have otherwise had. But that said, it coming at this from an engineering perspective, I think has afforded perhaps some benefits of some things I'd like to hope is at least a small contribution to the field.
Well, yeah. Definitely have done that. So anyway, this is a special format. We're going to try to do this monthly. Dr. Norwitz is going to take point on the interview. He can ask anybody who wants to talk about whatever he would like to talk about. So I am maybe going to step in every now and again and ask a question or two if I get curious, but otherwise I'm going to mute myself and just sit in on this wonderful opportunity to learn from two kind of sort of smart dudes. I really appreciate both of you and everything you have to offer, and I'm looking forward to this. And Dr. Norwitz, take it away.
Thanks, Casey. All right. So, I mean, considering that this is a platform where we might have some people who are unfamiliar with your lipid energy model and lean mass hyperresponders, which I think are the kind of two big concepts that we're going to be coming back to: lipid energy model and lean mass hyperresponder, or LMHR. Let's start there. Do you want to describe for people either of those terms, maybe starting with a lipid energy model or lean mass hyperresponder?
Yeah. So of course, right. My story begins with myself having gone on a low carb diet, seeing a surprise increase in my cholesterol levels. And part of why it was a surprise was both my dad and my sister, who got inspired at around the same time to also go on a low carb diet, did not see this pronounced increase in their total and LDL cholesterol like I did. LDL being commonly referred to as the bad cholesterol. And this concerned me quite a bit because I believe what my LDL was before was something in the neighborhood of around 180. And it had jumped up to 200 and something by 7 months into this low carb diet. Now, I then became very obsessed because I was feeling so great on the diet. I wanted to understand it better and, of course, also see if I could roll it back because I was very concerned about it being as high as it was. And I started researching everything I could on lipidology, and I found that actually this system within our body that moves around cholesterol, and this isn't new, it's that same system moves around the fat-based energy we use for fuel, which I'll get into in a second. But if you're powered by fat, that is kind of relevant because fat doesn't move around in the bloodstream very easily because it's like oil and water. It's an aqueous environment. Your bloodstream is water based. So you need these proteins in your bloodstream to carry fat around where it needs to. And one of those proteins is a lipoprotein. That when you hear LDL, that last L is a lipoprotein. It's a low density lipoprotein. And the lipoprotein is the carrier protein that carries not just cholesterol, but also carries this fat-based fuel, which we'll unpack in a moment. But that's kind of the starting point, because at that point, I realized that actually maybe I could change these numbers in a short span of time if it's just a matter of changing around my diet. And that's exactly what happened. As Casey mentioned a little bit earlier, the Feldman protocol was really kind of a hack at the time, in that I could consume a lot of fat while being on a ketogenic diet, and unintuitively, my LDL cholesterol would go down. We'll kind of unpack that a little bit more now. Basically, what I posit is happening, and without getting too deep into the weeds, because I want to keep this kind of high level, what I'm positing is happening is when I'm getting a lot of extra dietary fat, that means that my body has less of a need to circulate the stored fat in my body. And therefore, that will result in less LDL, because the LDL is usually it's kind of a downstream product of VLDL. VLDL being what my liver provides from stored fat that I ultimately got from my fat cells. So if I'm consuming a lot of fat but still staying ketogenic, it usually means that my body goes, oh, I'm in an abundance of fat, therefore I don't need to draw on my stored fat, therefore I don't have to traffic as many of these VLDLs, and therefore there's less LDLs. That's kind of the energy model in a nutshell.
Yeah. So let's unpack some of those terms, the VLDL, the LDL, and also triglycerides, which are like fat in the blood. Right. So if somebody's looking at this, like a lipid panel that their GP ordered or their PCP ordered, they're going to see probably a total cholesterol, which is the sum of all the cholesterol, the actual molecules in their blood. They're going to have an HDL cholesterol, which is a quote good cholesterol. Then they're going to have LDL, which is quote bad cholesterol, and triglycerides. Now, my understanding, focusing first on the LDL and the triglyceride component, is the life cycle of an LDL actually starts as VLDL. So your liver, like you said, it ships out these VLDL particles, these boats that carry this triglyceride fat fuel. You were just describing, these particles carry fats, and the VLDL go to peripheral organs like muscles, and they can drop off the fat, the triglycerides, at which point they become LDL molecules, which have fewer triglycerides. And those LDL should return to the liver and dock and be reabsorbed. So it's kind of like, boats shipping triglyceride fuel. The VLDL goes out, drops the triglyceride fuel off at the muscles, then returns to harbor at the liver. And that's a healthy way to circulate fat through the blood. Would you think that would be an accurate description?
That's pretty accurate. I would add just a little bit more to that. I would actually say that while one of its major customers, if you will, of the VLDL for where it's dropping off these triglycerides, which again is your fat-based fuel, is not just there, but actually in large part your adipocytes, which are your fat cells. Mm-hmm. So I like to use this analogy because I think it helps people get it a little bit better. There's sort of the major, let's say, shipping warehouse that's shipping out a lot of the product on the large trucks. We're used to these large trucks pulling up to, say, grocery stores. And the grocery stores then get re-inventoried from the bulk levels of stuff that's on the trucks. Mm-hmm. Well, you can think of those large trucks as like VLDLs. They've got 2,500 molecules of triglycerides, roughly, right? Which is a huge amount. If you want to sit down and break down the ATP on a per triglyceride basis, it's a massive amount of energy. That's why, typically one cell won't take up all of it. It usually can travel from cell to cell before it's finally depleted of all of its triglycerides. Again, kind of like these trucks going to these different grocery stores. And you can think of the neighborhood around the grocery store as the non-adipocyte tissue, like muscle tissue, for example. But the adipocyte, that fat cell, is kind of like the grocery store. It's getting constantly restocked by these VLDL. It's constantly getting its triglycerides dropped off, and then it releases those triglycerides as free fatty acids around, particularly when you're not consuming food, because it's no longer on the stocking, it's not that stocking time, if you will. So that's kind of the cycle. And I know you already know where I'm going to be going with this. I think there's an extremely important piece of this puzzle that's overlooked a lot that I wish wasn't, which is that I think a lot of this pattern we see, where that same lipid panel you just mentioned that people can be looking at, this pattern of where there's high levels of detected triglycerides in the blood, somebody has high triglycerides, is likely in large part a failure within the metabolic process of those triglycerides getting parked in either their stores or by non-adipocyte tissue. But there's a problem. There's a systemic problem in the delivery of these triglycerides. And that's why when a lot of people, they go on a low carb diet, if they see their HDL go up and they see their triglycerides go down, something I'm keenly interested in, to me, that says a lot that is likely, I think, to be good news, because it suggests that you're helping the process of the delivery succeed, particularly if you can get your triglycerides down, like say under 100, for example.
Right. So now we're focusing on triglycerides a little bit. And I think something that a lot of people don't realize is that even if you're just looking at the isolated metrics, and I know neither of us think that we should do that, having high triglycerides is a stronger risk factor for developing heart disease and having high LDL. So, you want to get your triglycerides.
A couple caveats, a quick caveat that I definitely have to throw in real quick. You want to be sure that when you're looking at triglycerides, you realize two things. One, they're very noisy. It's like glucose. It's a very noisy substrate. The other thing, though, is super important. If you're a low carb, you're listening to this for the first time and you haven't heard me bang this drum hard, you want to have a fully fasted test. You want to be 12 to 14 hours at least fasted when you look at your triglycerides, because if you're powered by fat, you're literally consuming and producing and shipping triglycerides at a higher rate than somebody who doesn't. So I just want to mention that. And with that context in mind, you're absolutely right. If there's any marker that I'm looking at first, unless the lab already has a fasting insulin, the first marker I'm looking at is triglycerides almost every single time. I think it's one of the most powerful markers if you were to look at one in isolation that's on a basic lipid panel.
So can you explain to people why, because this is counterintuitive, if you're on a high fat, low carb diet and you do a fasting lipid panel, the fat in your blood, the triglycerides, is lower. It's typically lower. This has even been shown in controlled studies where they control for protein, they control for weight. Can we just reinforce why that is, going over the VLDL and the LDL?
No, and in fact, I'm glad you brought this up, because people hear me talk about what we just talked about. Hey, you're shipping a lot more triglycerides on these VLDL. And even some prominent lipidologists that I've talked to, as you know, some podcasts that I've been on, for example, they immediately jump to, well, wait, if you're trafficking more of these triglycerides around in circulation, we should see them more in these blood tests. We should see that there's a higher quantity of triglycerides in any given moment. Mm-hmm. But that assumes incorrectly, in my opinion, that assumes that there's a static rate of shipment, if you will, as in the uptake of these triglycerides into these cells are going to be the same whether you're on a mixed diet or whether you're on a low carb diet or whether you're on a high carb diet, and for that matter, whatever your metabolic status is. And I vehemently disagree with that. I think in time there will be tracer studies. I'm confident there'll be tracer studies in those people, which we'll be talking about in a moment, lean mass hyperresponders, who are, I believe, very fat adapted, where I think that they have a very rapid rate of turnover. I think that they're barely shipping the triglycerides out of the liver before other different cells are bringing them up, which makes perfect sense, because after all, you're not powered as much by glucose.
Yeah.
And technically, getting back to that store analogy, you have less grocery stores scattered around, but you have a larger neighborhoods that they're servicing. Therefore, you need to be making more shipments. Therefore, it makes a lot more sense that triglycerides would be even lower, because while you may be secreting more of them, and overall, you actually have such a rapid and faster rate of uptake that it doesn't matter. You're going to end up seeing lower triglycerides on net, again, in a fully fasted test.
And just so people know, this isn't, what we're talking about isn't just theoretical. We're going to talk a little bit more about the lean mass hyperresponders, but, numerous people who are eating, probably a week's worth of fat according to standard guidelines in a day, and their triglycerides run 40 to 50 milligrams. I'm thinking about one in particular. But
anyway, definitely dependent on the existing person's metabolic health,
and so that as well. So if you're insulin resistant, what will happen is your liver will be putting out more triglycerides as well, just in a baseline context. We can talk about the HYDE trial, XYZ, maybe a little bit later. But one more question before we get into lean mass hyperresponder phenotype is, we do know that on a population level, LDL-C, LDL cholesterol, does correlate positively with cardiovascular disease. Can you explain, why LDL is elevated, on the population level, and that's correlated with heart disease, and how that differs from elevated LDL that you observe when going on a ketogenic diet, or that I myself have observed, or other lean mass hyperresponders?
Yeah, so of course, the very first thing I've got to caveat is I'm about to enter an area of hypotheses that I regularly caveat. But getting back to what we were just talking about, successful triglyceride delivery, there's also the higher HDL that tends to come with the lower triglycerides. As you know, and I'm not sure if we're going to have enough time to really get into all of that, but they tend to kind of correlate. There's a reverse version of this, a version where there's high triglycerides accompanied with low HDL. And this has been in the literature for literally decades. It's called atherogenic dyslipidemia. And the reason I'm bringing up this particular profile, where you've got high triglycerides, low HDL, is because it's much more associated with cardiovascular disease by far than many other different risk factors, this profile. Mm-hmm. And the reason I bring up this profile is I believe that we're going to find in time some amount of that higher LDL in those people who have atherogenic dyslipidemia as also being a consequence, not a cause. In other words, when you end up in a worse state, particularly of metabolic health, I again hypothesize that worse metabolic health can result in what we typically associate with what's known as metabolic syndrome, of which there's 5 criteria, and 2 of those criteria are the things I've just mentioned, low HDL and high triglycerides. That what's commonly happening is that you've got this failure within the system of moving those boats. And in that scenario, it makes a lot of sense as to why we would see the larger preponderance of small dense LDL particles, and why that pattern would show a greater degree of atherogenicity, of risk for increase of plaque. And that's why, as you probably well know, I have a standing challenge. I have, it's been almost 3.5 years now that I've had this up. I've requested, as kindly and as politely as I can, any and all data that would show that the reverse of the HDL triglycerides I've just mentioned with atherogenic dyslipidemia, where you have high HDL and low triglycerides, along with high LDL, would show cardiovascular disease risk. Because what I think is the problem, Nick, to just put it rather bluntly, is I think when we do look at a population level at just LDL, we're coupling too many people that have atherogenic dyslipidemia. And if it turns out to be true that some amount of the higher LDL is a downstream result of that atherogenic dyslipidemia, then that could be creating the association when there's just so many people that are in this first category. And there's so few people in this other category of the triad of high LDL, high HDL, and low triglycerides.
So you're basically saying we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And so just as a summary point for people, because I know there's lots of highs and lows, what you're saying is that, and I would tend to agree, if you look at a lipid panel, remember we have the LDL, the HDL, and the triglycerides. If you see high LDL, accompanied by by high triglycerides and low HDL, that is something we both be concerned about. High LDL in that context is something to be concerned about. I think most people would.
Right. In fact, if I could just inject this, because I feel like a lot of times what I'm saying is getting oversimplified by both supporters and critics alike, that I'm just being dismissive of LDL overall, that LDL is not a concern, but I'm dismissive of looking at LDL in isolation. So exactly what you just mentioned, I can tell you exactly what lipid panel would concern me that has high LDL, because I'm already looking at the triglycerides and the HDL. It's a larger kind of, I guess, broad statement that I'm pushing toward, is trying to look at these things in a profile, trying to look at them in a combined fashion, and looking at these patterns in a combined fashion to see what those patterns association with atherosclerosis actually are.
Yeah.
So yes, high LDL alongside atherogenic dyslipidemia, yeah, that's a bad panel in my opinion. I think that's not going to be good.
But go ahead, Casey.
No, I was just going to say, I spent several years doing these tests with people at the place I used to work at. And we were told to tell people, like, if they had high total cholesterol or high LDL by that standard, test that we would do, it would give you something to look for, but not necessarily tell you anything, like weight. If somebody says their weight is 400, that's something to look at. You kind of have some ideas about that person, but it doesn't really tell you anything. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's a decent analogy. I think, my opinion on this is LDL is kind of like weight. On the population level, it's a good proxy. If I told you somebody had a weight of, 206 pounds, what would you say? Like, is that person like overweight? Like, right. That's all the information you get.
Right. Is the person 5'1"? Is it a 6'5"? You don't know.
Usain Bolt happens to be 206 pounds. And you could say the same thing, even just for like BMI. I mean, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson has a BMI of 34.3. He's almost severely obese. So it's right on the population level, a proxy, but then you have to look deeper at the individual level, because when you're treating patients in a clinic, which neither of us are, medical doctors. So hopefully everybody's aware of that. But, that medicine is individual. It's between the clinician, the physician, and the patient. And you need to look at that individual, not just, use population health to just treat that individual. So I think that's kind of what we're saying. We're saying on the population level, this atherogenic dyslipidemia, this high LDL, low HDL, high triglycerides, it's driving this relationship between high LDL and cardiovascular disease. By contrast, there's this on the population level rare phenotype where people have very high LDL, but very low triglycerides, not high, but low triglycerides, and high HDL. And at this point in time, I don't think either Dave or I are aware of evidence suggesting that profile, which we call lean mass hyperresponders, a term coined by Dave, that profile predisposes somebody to be at high risk for heart disease. It doesn't mean that it doesn't. We actually don't know that. We'll talk about the study Dave's doing in a bit, but there's an absence of evidence. And so that was, yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so this is why I kind of like to identify the triad. Specifically, the cut points for a lean mass hyperresponder are an LDL of 200 milligrams per deciliter or higher, an HDL of 80 milligrams per deciliter or higher, and triglycerides of 70 milligrams per deciliter or lower. Recognize if you're not already swimming in this data, if you yourself are not already a medical professional, each of these individual three things I just mentioned, each of those cut points are already like unicorn status. It's very unusual to see people with even one of these markers at the ranges I just mentioned, which is why as an engineer, I'm so excited by this data, because I think we're getting to what may be some real mechanistic indicators, I think. But to get to where the data exists that we do have now, there's hardly any data that reaches those levels for the very reasons I just mentioned. They're so unique and unusual. However, we do have some data. There's some studies that have looked at the triad that we're interested in, where it's high LDL, high HDL, low triglycerides. And I have some of them that are posted to the website. By now, Nick, you're probably familiar with them. They're not many. There's like two main ones. There's one that was on the 4S that kind of did one, but it wasn't even on high HDL and low triglycerides. It was just at normal versus atherogenic dyslipidemia. And then there's a couple others that are a little bit more inferential.
Yeah. Well, the 4S one was the one with simvastatin, right? With
Yes.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the result in this study was if they did LDL lowering medication, simvastatin, a statin, on people with atherogenic dyslipidemia, it did improve outcomes. But if you looked at people that were only high LDL and they did not have atherogenic dyslipidemia, then there was a massive attenuation, a complete erasure, I think, of the benefit of that.
I think we could stand on massive attenuation. There already was a little bit of an issue that I had with the study in that atherogenic dyslipidemia was already like really low. I would have liked to have seen what we're just now discussing, which is high HDL and low triglycerides in the placebo arm. I would have really liked to have seen that.
And then some of the other trials, the Jepsen one, I think is one of your favorites, right? Jepsen 2001.
Yes, it is. That one I like because they first divided, they actually did this over several different strata, but one of them is that they divided it between an LDL of 170 milligrams per deciliter or below and 170 and above. And then they substratified within those two major groups between high HDL, low triglycerides, and so on. And you found that actually they look very close to each other in those substratifications. In other words, whether you had an LDL below 170 or above 170, if your HDL was high, your triglycerides were low, you had nearly an identical level of risk from your counterpart in the other group, in the low version. And again, we don't know for sure that this will extend to lean mass hyperresponders. We don't know if it'll apply to just people with this triad overall, but that's exactly why, we're wanting to just go get the clinical data and find out for ourselves.
Right. And in this study, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but based on those data, if somebody had to choose between having high HDL and high LDL or having low both for cardiovascular outcomes, would it be better to have the high LDL if it came with the HDL as compared to having low both?
So yes, I know for sure what the devil's advocates would come in and say. They'd be like, wait, this is entirely associational. And they would have kind of a fair point there, right? But that said, even if it's associational, this is sort of an issue that we're going to have with almost all of the data, save intervention studies that are actually making use of it, right?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, the devil's advocate to the devil's advocate is basically all the policies based on association data. And association data, here's the thing, that they're actually good for generating hypotheses and then trying to break down hypotheses. So if you see a correlation between LDL and heart disease, that's interesting for a hypothesis. That's it. That's all you can say. But if you see something going counter to that hypothesis, it's a stronger grounds for rejecting that hypothesis. So
you've heard me talk about this so many times, I'm sure, because I bring it up all the epidemiology. I like to state it plainly. I think it's not very good at proving causation. We do have Bradford Hill, which gives us some level of confidence, right? But that said, I do think it's actually quite good at providing evidence to knock down hypotheses.
Yeah.
So to use Bradford Hill itself, let's say that we were doing only studies in the United States, and we found that, there's this association with smoking and cardiovascular disease and also all-cause mortality, as we'd expect. But then let's say that we went over to Europe. And we went over to Europe and we found that actually all the centenarians were disproportionately 3-pack-a-day smokers. Now, I don't know about you, but that would start to challenge my assumption that it indeed was causal. I'd be like, wait, we should at least figure out what the differences are between these two places to better reconcile the nature of this hypothesis, because it's already breaking some of the Bradford Hill criteria. Yeah. It's breaking specificity and consistency and so forth. And this is why, I get a little bit on my soapbox about this, but bringing it back to your BMI example, I can't state this strongly enough. If BMI was the only measurement we had, then sure, you'd find an association between high BMI and like type 2 diabetes and blood pressure and so on and so forth, because we already know there are more people with a high BMI who are over fat than who are under fat, right? There's not a lot of Dwayne Johnsons out there, right? So if somebody comes in and they're like, you know what, BMI may not be the best measurement, let's at least substratify based on body fat, because it seems like we're getting a stronger signal on risk when we do that. As you know, that's a lot of what I run into in my space all the time is I'll say, hey, instead of looking at LDL in isolation, let's look at this profile of these other, let's look at all three and just see for ourselves. Could we get some data in here to like check out where these stratas lie? And I've done, of course, some amount of my own analysis with NHANES, but I'm not a biostatistician. And I would like to get more people to do it, especially with longitudinal data. I'd like if UK Biobank or Copenhagen or Framingham Offspring, they have lots of great longitudinal data. I would love to see this triad over time to see how much the lipid hypothesis really stacks up for those people who have this profile.
Yeah. So our interest group are these lean mass hyper responders. So it is this substratification where we're taking basically the Dwaynes out of the obese group and want to study those. Is Dwayne actually at increased risk of obesity, so to speak? And so you described the cutoffs, before. Worth reiterating just for anybody who's listening. An LDL above 200. A HDL below 80 and above 80, and then triglycerides below 70, or is it the triglycerides?
Yes. Yeah. I do want to take a moment to emphasize something though. The study, which I know where the waterline is on the things I can talk about and the things I can't. Mm-hmm. I technically can't talk about any of the inclusion or exclusion criteria, but I can tell you that we have raised money on it being a lean mass hyperresponder profile. So at a minimum, you'll know it'll be roughly this population.
Yeah. So just to clarify, we were talking about, this unique group. There's not a lot of Dwayne The Rock Johnsons, but that said, are LMHRs actually that rare? How many do you have?
Oh yeah, that's the joke. The joke is they're not that rare. What the profile was, like in the enhanced data, for example, that I was looking at, I think I saw 2 out of 44,000, something like that. 2 people out of 44,000. So it's a 1 in 20,000 chance that you happen to have an LMHR combination. Well, yeah, we have a Facebook group that's now at around 7,000. That's not all LMHRs, but I want to say I could comfortably guess that at least a fourth to a third of them are bona fide, as in they hit all those cut points I just mentioned. And at least a third, if not more, are borderline. That probably at least have the triad of some level of high LDL, some level of high HDL, some level of low triglycerides, even if they don't meet those exact cut points.
Right. And this is a phenotype that's pretty particular to people who are eating a low carbohydrate diet. I think that's the context in which we're speaking, which is becoming more and more popular. So this is becoming more and more relevant. There are more and more LMHRs every day trying to figure out what they should do about their cholesterol levels. And I'm going to ask you kind of unfair question because you're going to have to just completely make up a statistic out of your head. But my impression is that this, phenotype, it's pretty replicatable. Like if we went to a local gym and just took some random lean person, irrespective of their age, they're relatively lean, and we said, we're going to put you on a low carb ketogenic diet. What proportion of them do you think would turn out to be LMHRs?
Yeah, you're totally teeing me up on the softball questions because you know that I bring this up a lot.
Obviously, we're not talking at the level we normally talk.
Yeah. Well, no. But for real, I use this analogy a lot to kind of drive the point home because a lot of people throw a lot of speculation out as to why this group exists, including one of our favorites, which is ApoE4. Right. Well, maybe all the lean mass hyperresponders are really just ApoE4 or. Maybe they have a particular way in which they metabolize fat that results in this that's a as yet to be determined genetic abnormality. And no, what I do is I use this exact analogy you were just talking about to emphasize the point I want to make, which is I don't think so. I think if anything, there may be more likely genetic abnormalities that might make it less likely you become a lean mass hyperresponder. But I would be willing to bet, and I am pulling this out of nowhere, but given existing anecdotal data, I think that if I were to go down the street, grab a gym full of, and I want to describe the exact type of person, generally aerobic types, like cyclists, runners, yoga instructors, those types of people who are not necessarily doing a lot of resistance training, which we'll get into in a moment. But those types of people, if I grabbed a bunch of those lean people and I took them to Dave Island, where I said, you can eat as much as you want, but it's a carnivore diet. It's a high fat carnivore diet. It's there's no fiber. There's no high levels of PUFAs or oils or anything along those lines. I would bet you 75 to 80% of them would become lean mass hyperresponders. And I know how strong of a claim that is, but I stand by that. I think that we would see the triad with most of them. And to be sure, I'm a little bit prepped with this by also some work from Volek and Finney. I'm sure you've already read the paper, The Paradox of Hypercholesterolemia in Low Carb Athletes, something along those lines, which they compared with high carb athletes. And it showed almost ubiquity, higher levels. Again, Nick, the thing I have to kind of keep coming back to the top level view for is I don't understand, honestly, why there's not teams of PhDs on top of this right now, given not just what it's telling us about low carb diet, impact on lipids, but just metabolic impacts on lipids in this particular context, given its ubiquity.
Yeah. No, I mean, and let's focus in on, we're talking about lean mass hyperresponders, but where that lean comes from. Why, if you got a sumo wrestler for the gym, they wouldn't probably have this spike in LDL when they go low carb, but it's actually people with pretty low body fat. And my understanding of your hypothesis comes back to what you were describing before with the local and the global distribution, where if you have a lot of fat tissue sitting over a muscle and you're working it, there's going to be a local distribution of fatty acids. So if you're, say, going on a run and you have a lot of fat over your quadricep, that fat is going to be able to traffic a lot of fatty acids directly to the muscle. By contrast, if you're pretty lean and you have less fat to supply those fatty acids, what your body's going to have to do is upregulate its global distribution. So, take fat from elsewhere and ship it through the liver via these VLDLs, which then drop off the triglycerides, become LDLs, resulting in high LDL in people who are generally lean, especially those who have high activity levels. And while the data are pending, I know we can talk about, we know at least one LMHR with who's given us permission to talk about his case, who even when he gained a little bit of body fat and then was again weight stable at that new weight stability when he was at a higher body fat level, his LDL was lower, giving him activity, which, these kind of things just fall straight in line with the hypothesis. It's like every prediction that's made thus far. That's the thing I like about you. You make these predictions and do these self-experiments and they just turn out to work perfectly. That's what makes it such a cool model. In fact, as a sidebar, I think you need to describe one of my favorite of your N=1s, which is the white bread and processed meat experiment. Oh, yeah. That one is just so shocking. It's just the most paradoxical thing you can imagine.
Yeah, well, and for what it's worth, Nick, I go all the way back to fourth grade. Fourth grade, I remember the science teacher telling us about the importance of stating your hypothesis in advance. That you should be anxious, for that matter, to air your hypothesis and stand by it. And when it fails, feel good that you were clear about what you believed would happen. And he at the time was talking about, he had worked with a colleague before he had ultimately become a high school teacher. And the colleague went on to actually get an academic career in a university and doing research and so forth. And they still talked quite a lot. He was talking about how his friend was concerned with there being a higher level of post hoc hypothesis building. In other words, people getting the data first. And then in order to improve the likelihood that they get published, that they would then kind of build the hypothesis, And granted, this was back in the 80s. So this was a long time ago. But that said, that still left an impression on me coming all the way up to when I started doing this for real. For all my N=1 experiments, I try to put forward what my expectations are, what my predictions are, and I'm not always right. I have had a pretty good record with the the lipid energy model thus far, including this white bread experiment. So what happened is I recorded a video, so it was time stamped. I said I predicted that I'm going to actually get the lowest LDL I've ever had by the end of this experiment, and that's just exactly what happened. What happened is I went from a ketogenic diet. I kept it at baseline, took my blood every single day so I could see what my lipids were. And coming into the experiment at its peak, my LDL was around 296, which of course is considered substantially high. For those listeners who don't already know, the quote unquote optimal level is presumed to be at under 100. So my LDL at 296, I then introduce a diet that was intentionally selected by me to be an unattractive diet. And part of the reason I did that was because a lot of times people, when they talk about leaving low carb, high fat for an otherwise healthy diet. So, how many times have you heard it's the meat that's causing higher LDL or something along those lines? Well, so I selected a diet that's actually high in meat, but it's all lean processed meat. And its main form of carbohydrate was white bread, like the most nutritionally devalued
Wonder bread.
Yeah, it was Wonder Bread. I specifically got Wonder Bread. I think it's the only time in my life I've eaten Wonder Bread. And I had a continuous glucose monitor on the whole time, by the way. That was unfun entertainment for me to watch. I was trying to get to a point where I would just stop looking at it. But yes, I started just chomping down a whole bunch of white bread and processed meat. And I started my LDL started dropping in around 40 milligrams per deciliter a day, to where 7 days later, it had dropped 213 milligrams per deciliter, going from a 296 down to an 83. So I hit my goal of going down. In fact, I'm pretty confident I could have gone lower if I just had the stomach for it. The problem is the continuous glucose monitor readings were just bothering me a lot. And I also, I don't talk about this very often, but I also have concerns that there's risks in binging and kind of, I'm concerned that prolonged and acute levels of hyperinsulinemia can be a problem. And if you maintain it for a long period of time, that my concern is that you can outcompete elements systemically in your immune system. So anyway, I mentioned that more as just background as to why it is that I really wanted to just get to the number I wanted to see enough to then go ahead and get back off of that and get back to like a low carb diet.
Subjectively,
I think
go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I'm curious, subjectively, throw the numbers aside. How did you feel?
It's funny. I'm not really truly anti-carb per se, even though I enjoy a low carb diet, et cetera. I think there are many people who are on a high carb diet and they do fine. I've seen their blood work. I feel like their blood work looks good, et cetera. I'm going to still look at HDL and triglycerides, by the way. A lot of these people, I think their blood work looks good. They have high HDL or triglycerides. But I mention this because some of the experiments where I've done something like a carb swap didn't have much impact on me at all. I felt okay. This one was one of the I don't know if I'd say outliers. I've done like 3 or 4 of these that have had impacts on my mood. But the biggest thing I've noticed is just a higher level of anxiety.
Wow.
Now, I have to caveat that anxiety could have been in part induced by my seeing the CGM, seeing the high readings and so on and so forth. But that said, there were some things that were sort of general levels of irritability that I kept remarking back to Siobhan, who was working with me at the time. It's like super uncharacteristic for me. And they seem to kind of come, in and out in spurts. But there was one day, I still can remember it so distinctly. I was on a 2.5 mile walk, which I do every day to keep in control with the experiment so that the exercise is exactly the same every time. And I'm walking up to like some neighborhood street and a car is pulling in. And it's just like coming into the street and I'm like steps away from the street, but like all of a sudden I just got this frustration. Like, why didn't you just wait for me to cross the street?
Wow.
And even as I did that, I was like, seems kind of like a strong reaction, Dave. Is this like, something you would normally do. And I kept like walking down across the street. I kept walking down the sidewalk, and like half a block later, I was still stewing on it. I'm like, this is so weird that I can be both conscious that this is happening to me, and yet I can't get out of the mood.
Wow.
The mood is still there. Like I'm aware that I'm as frustrated as I am. And that is definitely uncharacteristic of me. I don't normally hold on to things for very long. Well, for that matter, I don't get frustrated by what is typical traffic patterns like that. But it felt a little more personal for some reason, like he was trying to quickly skirt in front of me when he could have been waiting.
Wow.
Again, not me. Like that's just not how I normally function. So it was, yeah.
There's a lot of, I know a lot of people who have said similar anecdotes. Obviously, we're not extrapolating from your N=1 broadly, but there is a lot of, biological plausibility, let's just say, behind it. And this isn't an episode about that, but we could talk about that.
I've definitely heard anecdotes. I've definitely heard anecdotes of people feeling that low carb, and granted, we swim in low carb circles, so it could be, lots of diets would do this, just getting healthier. But certainly a lot of people, including my colleague, Siobhan, who has just could not tout enough the presence of mind differences and the mood changes and so on and so forth that she feels are extremely material to her quality of life.
Yeah, no. This is something that ketogenic diets are being explored for mental illnesses. In fact, I wrote a paper with Dr. Chris Palmer at Harvard on it. You can look it up. It was ketogenic diets as metabolic treatment for mental illnesses. And we rank the levels of evidence, but there is good evidence for, a lot of different mental illnesses. Anxiety disorders weren't one we focused on, but everything from schizophrenia to certain eating disorders. So it's an area that's being explored because the mind's a little bit of a black box. But anyway, the reason I love your white bread, wait, first, what were your triglycerides at the end of the...
Yeah, though everyone likes to look at the LDL, but the triglycerides at the end were, I want to say 220, which is very unusual for me, particularly given they were fasted tests. They were, I was fully fasted at the time.
So the thing I love about your white bread experiment is because everybody would agree, eating processed meat and Wonder Bread as your diet is just unhealthy. Like it's going to lead to you dying early. Yet if you pulled the prank on your physician and you went in with an LDL of 296, which was the starting point, and then said, I'm going to go, change my diet and lifestyle. And you came back, they'd probably be suspicious after a week, even though this is a week experiment, but you came back in 2 months and your LDL was 83. How do you think they'd react? Do you think they'd give you a pat on the back?
Well, we already know this somewhat anecdotally from people who've done this in the LMHR community, is they'll do, and again, this is not recommended advice, anything, I'm just telling what people have done. Some people will go to even just an all fruit diet, just to effectively change it because there's, particular doctors they're trying to please. Again, I can't emphasize this enough. I actually really want everyone to work with their doctors and not feel that they should have to deceive their doctors. On the contrary, I feel like you want to give full perspective to your doctors. So that said, this data does show, a lot of people have showed kind of the same data where their LDL goes down. In some cases, they're fine on triglycerides, but in some cases where they're like me, particularly if they overate a lot, their triglycerides will end up being a bit higher. And you know what? This is also still kind of lingered with me a bit, in that I'm really interested how much of this was truly from the process. I know you're very familiar with de novo lipogenesis, which is your body's literally turning, effectively is turning the carbs into triglycerides and then shipping them out, et cetera, right? The reason I bring this up is that there's a study that's regularly touted as proving that overconsumption of carbohydrates does not have hardly any impact on de novo lipogenesis. And I think it's like from the 70s or something like that. But that said, you have to either explain my higher levels of triglycerides either as like lower levels of uptake, which I would find to be curious given I'm hyperinsulinemic. So you would expect that there would be a higher rate of uptake in my adipocytes, if anything, given the degree of storage, if that's the only fat availability that there is, right? Unless I was already over fat from like personal fat threshold and so forth. Or that there really is a greater degree of secretion, suggesting that there is more production on the DNL side. But it's one or both of those to help better explain why I was so hypertriglyceridemic even after being so long fasted.
I mean, that probably comes down to people's baseline metabolic health, which we talk about a lot, and like the kind of carbohydrates you're eating. So if you're, an Okinawan and you're eating a low fat, high carb diet, and you have a lot of like fresh, like low glycemic index fruits and vegetables, and you just overeat, I'm not sure your triglycerides would go up. But if you're a metabolically unhealthy American, and most are, at least 88% based on 2016 NHANES data, then if you overeat carbohydrates, even like fruits, mechanistically, we would expect you to have hypertriglyceridemia, because if you're insulin resistant in your liver, what's supposed to happen is that your insulin goes up, and insulin signals de novo lipogenesis, triglyceride production in the liver. But when you're insulin resistant, your insulin levels around your body are actually going to end up going higher because your pancreas is trying to compensate. So you're insulin resistant. You have a little bit of carbohydrates, then the de novo lipogenesis process in the liver isn't insulin resistant. So not everything becomes insulin resistant equally. So you have a compensatory high insulin level that's then overstimulating your liver to produce more fat if you're insulin resistant, which again, I would say the majority of Americans are to some extent. The paradox there, and I learned this from Ben Bickman, is that what's supposed to happen when your insulin goes up is it inhibits gluconeogenesis, so the production of sugar by your liver, and stimulates fat production, de novo lipogenesis. But if you're insulin resistant, there's a bifurcation in the pathway in the liver such that you're insulin resistant, you have really high insulin levels. The high insulin levels overstimulate fat production, but they can't inhibit gluconeogenesis. So then you get your liver dumping sugar and fat into your bloodstream. The paper was, I think, Lee et al. It wasn't a mouse study. It was in PNAS, I think, in 2010. But I thought that was very interesting because it explained the, potentially high glucose levels or high production of glucose in diabetics, as well as high triglycerides. So,
but there is another key component to that, which of course is the fat cells themselves, the adipocytes. Mm-hmm. In the presence of the higher insulin, and assuming that you don't also have hyperglucagonemia, right? Then for sure they should be like, oh, it's uptake time. We've got lots of insulin signaling. We're going to go ahead and take it up. We're going to actually develop. And this kind of even touches on my talk before with lipoprotein lipase. I would expect lipoprotein lipase activity to be much higher. However, there's problems that are occurring, all of which we're in the process of discovering, and all of which we all have our own hypotheses on. Personal fat threshold is sort of brought up a lot. I actually have my own hypothesis that I'm kind of developing. That's kind of a step further in that, I guess. Mm-hmm. Which kind of actually gets back around to membrane development, which I think is actually kind of key and may even help explain the white bread experiment, by the way. I think it's actually possible that at a local level, adipocytes could be rejecting uptake, not because they are maxed out, but because they are maxed out in expansion threshold capability. I almost want to call it personal growth, or I should say metabolic growth threshold.
Yeah.
Membrane growth threshold. That's what I want to say. So
why would everybody's be different? So I think just high level for people, what we both kind of, I would think, believe is different people have a different ability to get fat subcutaneously before they get sick. If you're storing fat in your subcutaneous fat tissue, that tissue under your skin, that's actually not that unhealthy if you're doing it properly, and you can start to balloon up. In fact, you can take mice and overexpress GLUT4 selectively in their subcutaneous fat, and they will balloon up to be these massive obese mice, and they're perfectly metabolically healthy. Right. So there are people that are like that, and we're all on a spectrum, which is this concept of personal fat threshold or personal, adipocyte expansion threshold. So people probably can't see me right now, but I'm a pretty small guy. I think if I really tried to push myself, I would not be able to get to 180 pounds without first getting diabetes. That's obvious speculation, but based on like my health history and how I store fat, that's what I would predict. Whereas there are people that they live and they're 500, 600 pounds. Now at that point, they're probably insulin resistant, but they might not have diabetes. So how is that? How can some people get so big and other people can't get as big without getting a metabolic disease? So I think there is a unique individual expansion threshold, and it would be phenomenal if we knew what determined it.
Well, here's where there's a lot of keys to the locks. Unfortunately, now particularly when we're talking about things like membrane management, you've got a lot of rabbit holes when it comes to the amino acids. Mm-hmm. That could be, you could be in short supply of particular amino acids to make the particular proteins that help with the enzymatic mechanisms to make that happen, right? But here's the beauty. If anybody listening has gotten lost in all of this, here's where you can bring it back to, which is, what would I expect if you're exceeding all these different complex versions of what we're talking about? I would expect that you, as we often see, are starting to lose functional participation by your fat, by your fat tissue, by your adipose tissue, right? That participation, that active and effective participation, often manifests in high triglycerides. Your body is now systemically having a problem parking the triglycerides where they're normally getting parked, which is in your adipocyte. So the grocery stores are getting shut down now. Why? Why are they, not able to service their customers? That, I think, is why looking at lipid panels may actually be much more prognostic than is assumed. And ironically, in the two metrics that they're not normally looking at, they're normally looking at total and LDL cholesterol. They're not usually looking as closely at HDL and triglycerides. And I know you're aware of this. There's actually more and more pressure to downplay HDL in particular. Lipidology is, there are many saying that we shouldn't even be measuring it anymore, that we shouldn't even be looking at HDL cholesterol.
Yeah. I mean, that's I mean, you could make a case for it, but the case you would have to make for it is the same case we're making for LDL here, that it's a proxy and there are exceptions. So for example, if you have high matrix metallic protease 9 levels associated with your HDL, there is evidence suggesting that HDL is dysfunctional and those high HDLs aren't going to be productive. So there are subgroups of people with high HDL in which that high HDL is not very protective. That said, I would say on the population level, so maybe this is a little bit hypocritical, but high HDL, especially in the context of low triglycerides and this LMHR phenotype, is a much stronger predictor of being metabolically healthy than is having, say, low LDL. And yeah, no, the adipocyte biology and the fat cell is not a passive storage vessel, but is something that is really central to your metabolic health. I think there's such a strong case to be made for that. In fact, if you downregulate glucose receptors in fat cells selectively, so only in fat cells in mice, it will cause the muscle cells in those mice to get insulin resistant. So if you start becoming insulin resistant in your fat cells, what happens in a human? Well, your muscle cells become insulin resistant and they're sinking 80% of the glucose you eat. So now when you eat, glucose is going to be more in your bloodstream because it can't sink anywhere. And that's going to cause other problems. And it starts this, sort of vicious cycle.
Can I add to that? Also on the lipoprotein lipase side, they've done the same thing where they've had overexpression in, I think it's skeletal muscle. Mm-hmm. And you get mice that seem to be practically impervious from gaining fat weight. So they actually are very lean, buff mice, but they develop insulin resistance in their muscle tissue not too long after that. So again, you without question, this is the gift that we have had in the last decade and a half, is that there's much more focus on adipose tissue being an extremely active and crucial endocrine organ. Whereas before it was sort of thought of as just a sink, something where you just stuff the fat and you can, pretty much forget it from there. But no, it's doing enormous amounts of signaling. And that's, of course, very central to our model.
Yeah. Now I'm going to ask kind of like a button pushing question, which is, you described your response. You said your LDL went from 180 to what?
130 to 229 or
Yeah. So what is what are the extremes of the lean mass hyperresponder phenotype? Those big numbers that you see on people, and like how many people present with them?
So yes, this will be somewhat controversial, but data is data, and we should be comfortable sharing it. There are many. Let me see. I'm going to say that there are at least roughly 50 to 60 that I am aware of ad hoc, as in just people who participate in polls or have reached out to me, that are in the neighborhood of an LDL of 500 or higher. And the reason I'm picking the cut point of 500 in particular is that's considered comparable to homozygous familial hypercholesterolemia. For those who are not familiar, that's literally the genetic disease that results in higher LDL. And you know what, we should actually take a quick aside, because this is kind of important when talking about the study and when talking about the evidence overall. While I talked a little bit earlier about what I posit may be a lot of the resulting high LDL association with atherosclerosis being possibly downstream of atherogenic dyslipidemia, a lot of people would say, actually, we have non-atherogenic dyslipidemia populations for which there's high LDL and high cardiovascular disease. And they would point to those people who have this genetic disease, familial hypercholesterolemia, particularly the more severe form is known as monogenetic familial hypercholesterolemia. If you're lost, don't worry. Here's what I'm getting to. What I'm getting to is, thus far, you really could not have an LDL of above, say, 500 without having this disease. You had to have had something that, for example, there are a few different variations of it, but they all impact lipid metabolism at some level, such as the LDL receptor being mutated and therefore having poor binding and therefore having poor clearance. And so the seminal work of Brown and Goldstein, going back to 1972 when they first merged their labs, their pivotal patient was a little girl who had homozygous FH. Her LDL was around 70 or 750 something, I don't know. Total cholesterol was around 850, something like that. And she had developed a stable angina. This is the typical chest pain that comes with rapidly developing atherosclerosis at age 3. It's very heartbreaking. And xanthomas, which are like deposits of fat that are on the extremities. And then sadly, she had her first MI, a myocardial infarction, a heart attack at age 6. And that, from their perspective, and it's understandable why they would feel this way, that was about the most powerful causal evidence that high LDL results in this rapid progression of atherosclerosis. Specifically, it's the strength criterion in Bradford Hill. Okay, so now let's take this back to lean mass hyperresponders. I did a recent count. There's 14 that I know of who have an LDL at 700 or higher. 14. The homozygous FH phenotype is a 1 in a million. Like, it's a 1 in a million chance you have homozygous FH. We have 14 that have developed it strictly from diet. And again, this is just ad hoc. There could be many more. Naturally, I emphasize to those that, hey, this is uncharted territory. Even if I'm cautiously optimistic, you really need to figure out for yourself what you feel is right, et cetera. Some of them changed gears and wanted to head back down. Some of them are very comfortable with it. A few of them really just don't have a choice from their perspective. In other words, they have other dietary needs or they have other issues that they would consider to be more important for the time being. But virtually all of them have doctors and cardiologists. Some have cardiology teams wrapped around them right now who are doing lots of different tests on them. So
I think the point to emphasize here is if you have like familial hypercholesterolemia, it's congenital. Like your cholesterol is just high. Your LDL is high no matter what, right. More or less. But the people we're describing, they adopt a dietary shift that, consistent with the lipid energy model, will predict a spike in LDL, and then their LDL goes up. So some people A lot of these people you're describing with LDLs over 500 pre-ketogenic diet, pre-high fat diet, their LDLs were sub 100. So
I don't
I know one with an LDL of 565 who pre-keto at an LDL of 90. So
gotcha. Yeah. I don't know that I have a lot of that data to know for sure, but they've all been nobody was over 200 before that I'm aware of.
Well, the main person with the pre-data that's coming to mind went from 90 to 565 at max. Right. So I mean, like that alone, again, it's not. It's sufficient to counter the concept that this is familial.
Right. Well, and many of the ones I just mentioned have had genetic testing. We know at least they don't have the monogenetic version. There may be one of these ancillary level, LDL modifiers, but they're like tweaking type. I mean, bottom line is, if you didn't have high LDL before going ketogenic, then you almost certainly don't have what's often called molecular genetic familial hypercholesterolemia.
Yeah. And so just I want to get into the practical, then talk about your study a little bit, but in terms of practical things, maybe there's some LMHRs listening that aren't in your group. And if they have an LDL that's high and they want to bring it down, but like you described, they want to stay low carb, what are tips you typically, suggest to people to help bring their LDL down while staying on a ketogenic diet?
Well, of course, the top advice I give, usual caveat, it's not medical advice, but the top result that seems to succeed the most is literally leaving keto. You can still be low carb, or at least most people can still be low carb, but typically bringing carbohydrates up to around 100 grams a day. That tends to have seemingly that tipping point threshold. I posit that the reason for that, which kind of also gets back to the energy model, is that you're repleting hepatic glycogen stores. If you get hepatic glycogen stores up to a certain threshold, there's less ongoing lipolysis and therefore less resulting LDL, et cetera. Now, second to that, some people have brought in more fiber. Some people, and we can kind of get into what the speculation is to the mechanisms for that. But some people have seen changes by bringing down their fat and bringing up their protein levels. But that one's really the last two that I've just mentioned are sort of hit or miss. They're a little less quantifiable.
What about shifting your fatty acid intake from less saturated to more monounsaturated or even poly?
Yeah, this one comes up a lot. This one usually has a marginal effect if mainly moving from saturated to monounsaturated. It tends to have the most dramatic effect when moving from saturated to polyunsaturated, particularly if people are making use of more PUFA-rich oils. I'll be honest with you, I'm not that probably one of the last things I would consider myself, especially if we're getting into oils. If it's more PUFA-rich, foods such as like avocados, that might be more acceptable for me.
Avocados aren't that PUFA-rich. Mufa.
I mean, relative to like eggs and like red meat and stuff like that.
I'd say like walnuts, seeds, let's say raw seeds and nuts for the most part.
Yeah. And that's another one. I think some people have kind of experimented with that too. There's also, I say this only half jokingly, but it's worth mentioning because it does kind of play back to the model. You can also just gain weight, particularly if it's fat mass, and you can also exercise less. Both of those will probably, you can flip this, right? Like if I'm designing a lean mass hypersmart, I'd grab somebody who's super lean, super athletic, and get them really super low carb. That's the power 3. Yeah. And we have people coming into the lean mass hypersmarter group every single day who are exactly what I just described. And they're going, I don't know what happened. I didn't even realize this was possible. And then there's like this whole community now that's like, yeah, here you go. And then they'll talk about their experiences and so on and so forth.
Yeah, no, I really didn't believe this when I all heard of it, but I've tried these things myself. And yeah, you exercise more, your LDL goes up. You gain a little bit of weight, your LDL goes down. So in summary, you're saying, okay, you can come off keto and be more low carb, around 100 grams a day. Fiber seems to help, as do phytosterols, although I'm not necessarily recommending those either.
That's true. Yeah.
Phytosterols do help because they block cholesterol absorption. They kick them out of meat cells. But if you're a hyperabsorber, phytosterols are more atherogenic than cholesterol. A lot of people aren't hyperabsorbers, which is different than hyperresponders. But anyway, you could do that. And then you could, exercise less, gain weight, more PUFA, or those were the main things we said. But
anyway. Or if you really want, if I were prioritizing just having the lowest LDL possible, I would be on a high carb, low fat diet.
Yeah.
I would, be taking cholesterol lowering medication on top of all of that.
Yeah.
And for what it's worth, I say this often, I think it gets missed. If my only interest was to avoid cardiovascular disease events or risk, I think I have enough evidence somewhat, not conclusively, that that's exactly what I do. I try to get my LDL as low as I possibly could. As you know, I care much more about all-cause mortality.
Yeah.
So I don't like to look at a particular endpoint. I like to look at all the endpoints as a base point to start from.
Well, I think that's a very important thing because it's like somebody might argue, well, okay, we're not really sure if LDL causes heart disease, especially in these people, these LMHRs. But let's be conservative and just bring their LDL down because we don't know.
Right.
And let's use a medication to do that. And what I would say to that is that, giving somebody a prescription drug, it has side effects and there are potential negative consequences. So the first principle, or one of the first principles of the Hippocratic Oath in medicine, is do no harm. So is it fair to take a powerful prescription drug and give it to a population of people in whom there actually isn't strong evidence that it is beneficial? Maybe it is. But what about all the side effects? I mean, I know a lot of people like muscle cramps, or your chance of developing insulin resistance and diabetes is higher if, say, you're on a statin. Not that I'm saying nobody should be on statins. I'm not of that opinion. But I just think that's an important conversation to have that's not being had right now. It's very algorithmic. Your LDL is above 190, regardless, you go on a statin.
Yeah, I mean, look, I've started the same issue in that I don't like extending studies that have been done on sick populations to healthy populations. I would love it. I truly would. If there was a study that was funded on low risk populations for primary prevention with statins, and you could totally do an RCT in this case. Yeah. I would like it though, if they would do it more as I think of for myself, a real randomized double-blind control trial. Yeah. My one issue with a lot of these trials, particularly cholesterol-lowering medication, but it's really lots of different trials, that they'll have run-in periods. I feel like that, unfortunately, can mute side effects or other possible downstream long-term issues. There's arbitrary start-stop times, which I also don't like. I don't like it if they're, event-driven. I'd prefer if they were just like a fixed amount of time.
Yeah.
But on top of that, there's not a again, I don't like extrapolating from what we saw worked with a particular population and assume it just works for everybody.
Yeah. Tell me if you don't want to answer this question, but if you were to go on an LDL lowering medication, people just tend to think of statins, but which one would you go on?
Yeah, I can't answer that question.
Okay. All right. We won't go down.
Immediately get interpreted by people who are critics of my work as somehow medical advice.
I just know a lot of people in this community who, they're trying to find the reason I asked, trying to find common ground with their doctors. And I don't think that they always get provided the other drug options, which from my understanding, not being an MD yet, that I think that they carry lower risks. I'm also particularly thinking about the brain. I'm a neuroscientist by trade, and some of the effects that statins could have on the brain. I feel like qualified to comment on that, just because my PhD's in neurodegenerative diseases. So anyway, we'll table that.
Here's the one thing I would say. I absolutely respect everybody's decision to make their personal health choices, not just with cholesterol, but with anything.
Yeah.
So when it comes to things like medication, I mean, of course, it's just general policy for myself and my colleague. We just don't comment on whether somebody should go on or off, and it's not really our place to say. That's between them and their doctor. But it is a challenge to people like yourself who become very educated in this space and may have some research to share. I feel like you should be able to say, this is the research I've been able to see so far. Here's what, I've observed in, these different ways, because it's actually your space, like what you're talking about with brain health.
Yeah.
If I were considering it, and that's why I bring this up, I'd probably get your advice on it. Not because I would take your advice as the advice of my doctor, but because of course I want to get, resources wherever I can.
Yeah. I think this is now getting a little bit philosophical, but I think it's an important point when we're talking about this, physician patient relationship, that people know that they have the right to advocate, that this is a partnership, that you don't want it just to be a paternalistic system. You do this, you do that. And often just the way our system is built, and now I'm speaking from this with authority from the position of somebody who was a patient in a lot of doctors' offices. And so this is something that, hit home personally for me. It's you feel uncomfortable advocating for yourself because you're just the patient and this is the doctor that should know everything. And so you should just follow what they have to say. The truth of the matter is that doctors are just people. And I think we need to be appropriate about our expectations of them, and they need to be humble about their knowledge. And that means coming to the patient and saying, explaining what the limitations of their knowledge are, being open to listening to data brought to them by the patient, because it's totally unfair to think that they know everything that's coming out in their field. Like in my field alone, even in just like the area of Alzheimer's disease, there's like papers every day. I just can't possibly keep up. It's not possible. So if somebody came to me with new data, I would try to interpret it in the context of their case, or I would hope. And there's a flip side to this that I see a lot in social media, which makes me really sad, especially in the low carb community, which has become quite disillusioned by the advice that we maybe get for conventional medicine. There's a lot of doctor bashing and talking about the integrity of physicians in pretty negative ways. And I just think that's so it's unfortunate and unfair, because every physician I've ever met, almost everyone, is genuinely there to try to do their best from the patient. And so if you can figure out how to, access that drive and open-mindedness in a way that isn't overly challenging. I just think, this is a really hard thing to express concisely, but finding a way to actually have that true partnership with your clinician is such a powerful thing. And I do think, people should go with their doctor's advice, because the doctors are generally more informed than right. But that's it. The doctor needs to listen to what the patient's concerns are and what their questions are, and really convince them about what they're doing, rather than just say, do this.
I think both things can be true at the same time. I think we can acknowledge that much of the low carb movement is a grassroots movement that came out of many people, myself, yourself included, that got advice that wasn't working for them. And now, coming from non-doctor sources, they got advice that seems to be working very well for them. Mm-hmm. It fosters a sort of, general level of skepticism that for some, because I don't want to paint with a broad brush, but for some, it really does further foster a greater disrespect towards the medical community in general. And sometimes, aimed at their own doctors. And that's the other part that I think we should acknowledge. I say this often. I don't know how long you've been following my Twitter, but I say this often. Doctors, they came into the field to be healers. They want to help people.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's some, but I believe the vast majority of doctors were like, I want to do this because I want to succeed at making people better. I want to help them live healthier lives, right? And to the degree with which there are things we are critical of, I think a lot of them, if we look closer, if we look under the hood, such as like the limited amount of time your doctor gets to spend with you, a lot of these are systemic in nature. It's not because your doctor doesn't like you and wouldn't like to spend more time focusing and better understanding a lot of these problems, right? And, to your point from earlier, I'm sure it's true when I'm telling my doctor about my latest experiments and why this leads me to believe, or at least feel more optimistic about my higher LDL in this context. I'm probably the, 25th person who brought up self-attained information that day, where he's heard all sorts of, crystal healing and many other different things that he feels very confident were wrong. And so I'm just sort of the end of the train, if you will, right? But to your point, and this does need to be said, I really do think doctors need to continually be curious, and they need to continue to be scientists. They need to be interested in finding new sources of data as it comes. That's where a lot of these great stories like Ted Naiman's and David Unwin's, they had pivotal patients. Those patients, brought them into a new understanding. That's what we want to be for our doctors, is pivotal patients, if we do have something new to share.
Yeah. I guess what I'm saying is, because most people listening are probably going to be more the patients, especially the low carb patients, rather than the doctors. I want to almost point the finger at you and say the onus is almost on you to be, thoughtful and tactful in your approach, so that you don't come off as that person that's like, oh, I found on the internet crystal healing. Like, think about how to pose the questions. And I can tell you from personal experience, now I'm equipped with a little bit more resources, but the doctors, like, if you approach them the right way, they will open your mind, and you have an opportunity to transform their perspective, and be that pivotal patient, like Dave was saying. So I think this is a great opportunity, and I'm very optimistic because of the general trend I see of people with a pretty conventional mindset opening up to this and actually shifting over to it, in terms of their perspective and even sometimes their practice. Whereas I know very few, actually, I don't know any personally, of people that are going from the low carb lipid energy model perspective back to convention. I've never met that person. And if you are that person or know that person, please refer them to me. I'd be interested to hear their journey. But I've heard a lot of people go the other way. So it seems like the intellectual conversion only goes one way. And yes, I do have a bias sample, but still, I
don't, though. I'm tuned in, as you know, to lots of people who are critics of my work. And in a lot of ways, I think it's part of my secret weapon, is that, that saying, keep your friends close, your enemies closer, or something along those lines, right? The people who are the most critical of my work, oftentimes, the ones who are productive. I don't want to hear people who are just ranting and calling names and so forth. But those who are critical of my work, I'm watching how they are analyzing and taking down the model, what critiques they have, even if they're not talking at me or don't want to talk to me, but they're talking to other people. In social media, that's the beauty of it. You get to see it all the time. And so to me, I want to say one of the things I find fascinating is that I feel like there's a lot more landscape changes. I feel like I've kept actually a lot of examples on my desktop in a folder, which may at some point make it into the book. But a lot of the critiques I was getting, say 3 years ago, kind of shifted gears a little bit, particularly as we get closer to this study. Because I've asked people straight up, I've said, do you believe this is a high risk population? Do you believe that at a minimum, they'd be in the top, say, third of cardiovascular disease risk, these lean mass hyperresponders, when we're finally really watching for their progression of atherosclerosis? Actually, I should give a quick intro real quick, because I know we've sort of mentioned the study in passing. We both know what it is, but for the listener who doesn't know, this is what the study is beyond just that we're looking at lean mass hyperresponders. We're getting a snapshot of their arteries at day 0, and then again 1 year later. So it's what's called longitudinal data, so that we can have comparison scans, what it looks like at first and what it looks like at the end. The scan is a CT angiogram, which you effectively get a contrast dye brought in, but it actually will map the geography of your cardiovascular disease or your cardiovascular system, so that you can detect, literally isolate down into the total amount of plaque and where they're located and all of that. So anyway, Now that we're getting this close to the study, it seems as though there are more people who were originally more concerned for lean mass hyperresponders who are now saying, well, we don't actually think this study will give us a lot of information because we don't actually think there'll be a lot of progression. And I'm being the cordial me that I am. I kind of want to be like, this wasn't your position the entire time. But at the same time, I think that's good. I think that means that there's more people who have access to their own data who are coming to this conclusion on their own. But again, that's the optimist in me that's looking at it that way.
Yeah. But anyway, yeah, I'm super excited for those data to come out, as they're probably going to inform what I do in future. And it's just approaching these things with an open mind. I don't think either of us are closed off or will be upset per se if it turned out LMHRs have rapid progression of atherosclerosis. I would find that very,
Yeah, I mean, for sure. And I've said this publicly many times before. If that were found, Cholesterol Code, the site we run, would immediately turn that data around. We'd be and I would feel that lean mass hyperresponders should be taking steps immediately to start bringing down their level of progression.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of people that have found a lot of benefit out of a low carb lifestyle. And so you need to know is this safe or is this not? So, I mean, we talked in another podcast, Casey, about, my case and what a ketogenic diet did for me. And I am a lean mass hyperresponder. So my LDL is very high. And quite frankly, I'm like you, Dave, I'm cautiously optimistic. I don't think there's sufficient evidence to suggest that I should be taking medications for it. That said, I really want to know for my own health's sake, long-term health, is it consequential? Should I be doing things? Right now, going out of ketosis really isn't an option for me. But if the data say that, I should take a medication, I'm not going to spite myself and die early for the sake of that.
Well, I want to reiterate something we talked about earlier. We're talking about cardiovascular health, not necessarily all-cause mortality or how somebody feels. Like, maybe I don't care if I die at 60 of a heart attack if I have a kick-ass life and feel really good and have good reproductive health. I've got, energy. All of those things are also really important to take into balance.
For sure. I mean, ironically, that's the argument I used when starting a ketogenic diet in my own mind. I went through a litany of diets and we're trying them all, and keto was at the bottom of the list. And I'm like, all right, I know fat's bad. I know fat's going to kill me, but you know what? My life sucks so much right now. I don't even care. Like, if it works, let me just try it. Yeah. And now that I've actually looked into the data, I don't think that's the case. But quality of life matters so much, I think.
And let's face it, we're all in this experiment together. Those of us who've done, I'm not waxing philosophic. This isn't me speculating on some random population. Even if I know a lot of lean mass hyperresponders with higher LDL, my LDL is still in the 99th percentile for the population, right? At 250, 270 milligrams per deciliter. It would absolutely, if I were in a doctor's office, they would say you should be on a maximally dosed statin. And I'm going to see if I can apply to get you on a PCSK9, stat. Yeah. That's the reality. So I like to say this as a good scientist. The term pioneer is somewhat romanticized, but it usually refers to those people for who it worked out for, right? We don't know what we don't know, but on the plus side, we're right there. We're in IRB right now. It's taken, a year and a half to get us to this point. Technically, it's taken more than that. It's taken 3 years because for the first year and a half, and I'm going to have this in the book, for the first year and a half, I tried to just do this through the quote unquote normal channels. And I had, people were working with me to connect me with the right people. I just couldn't get it done. And I'm still to this day surprised that I just couldn't get it done because I figured it was such a key population to look at. And then about a year and a half of that, I eventually just said, screw it. I'm going to get up on a Houston stage at this conference. I'm just going to ask people to fund this study, which I have to tell you, I had no idea if that was going to work or not. I thought there was a decent chance, I would announce it and there'd be a couple $1,000 maybe after a month. That was all possible to me. And props to the low carb community. They really stepped up. We're at $250,000 now. Wow. And so we're now close to about fully funded.
Yeah, no, it's super exciting, and I'm predicting here and now that word will be applied to you in some decades at least, and you'll be in textbooks as a pioneer. The Samuel Weiss or Pasteur type. I mean, everybody thinks people are crazy, when you have somebody who's a really novel thinker and trying to turn a model on its head. And it even now, as I think about it, given all I've internalized just from growing up in the society we grew up in, I still have a hard time, mulling it over. But after really looking at the logic and hearing you speak multiple times and looking at the data, it's hard to contradict. In fact, I don't think it really can be contradicted. That's why the model is still the model, and that's how science progresses. You try to take down the model to evolve it, and thus far, it hasn't really been broken. It's been evolved. I know you spent now almost 7 years evolving it, and that's what you're supposed to do with models.
Yeah, but even the triad, I mean, that was an early principle, and it's stronger now than it was before. Like I've taken so many different advanced lipid tests, but just those three in combination are still so powerful, and they're usually very indicative of all the things you're usually looking for, like the proportion of small dense LDL particles and so on and so forth. It's crazy just how much that's kind of stuck around.
Yeah. Well, the core model is, as every time you test it, it gets stronger. It just gains detail.
Right.
But the core, whereas other models about heart disease, I think that they've gotten weaker over time. As you continue to test them, they don't have support, like the lipid heart hypothesis.
Well, in a roundabout way, I mean, the thing I really want to test, if I were just wanting to test that in particular, and I've said this a lot to critics of my hypothesis, I've said, look, why don't we just look to any state, even outside of low carb keto, including fasting for that matter, where you're seeing a higher level of LDL, but an otherwise functional lipid metabolism.
Yeah.
Because it seems like if it's either genetic abnormalities that result in problems with lipid metabolism or metabolic pathway problems with lipid metabolism, just get that part of the equation out. Let's look at healthy vascular systems with a healthy lipid metabolism, but also high LDL. And that's what lean mass hyperresponders, this is why I think they're really going to be a group that can bring us so much powerful information, including on risk.
Well, do you want to talk about brown bears?
Oh yeah, brown bears. So this is a pretty good timing because we'll have to close off here soon. But yes, I think next to the white bread experiment, it's maybe some of my favorite research, even though it's animal model research per se, right? But yeah, brown bears that hibernate, and I had this in a recent talk, have hyperlipidemia, as in they have high levels of lipids, particularly cholesterol. And they were curious. I think what spurred them into this is they were looking at them in captivity because, of course, they're already in, say, zoos and so forth. And they were like, during this hibernation period, I mean, they're just constantly running at super high levels of total and LDL cholesterol. Maybe the wild bears are different. Maybe this is something about what's happening in captivity. So they also went out and had something fairly elaborate where they actually were hunting bears from off a helicopter. It would actually, or not hunting them, I'm sorry, they would actually tag them so that they could then take blood tests. So they would tranquilize them from the helicopters. But then they also had some who were hunters in certain areas, and they would get cross sections of their LAD, I want to say, the bear's descending aorta. Anyway, what's cool about this is, in spite of the super high LDL, no atherosclerosis. And they posited all of these different things that it could be, like maybe they handle stress better, maybe they handle lots of different things. But technically, these bears, especially when getting fattened up for hibernation, had obesity per se, right? And they were sedentary. So they had all of the ingredients of what we would expect that would see higher atherosclerosis, but weren't seeing it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so cool. The concept is that it's consistent with the lipid energy model, that they're running off fat.
Yeah.
So they're shipping they have high LDL because they're shipping the fat around the body. That's a funny aside.
And another one is migratory birds. They have to go long distances fasted. So what that paper posited was that they were deriving a lot more from VLDL in particular.
Do we know what the LDL? I have no clue, so I'm not teeing you up for anything. What the LDL is for like lean carnivores, like a tiger? Do we know?
I don't know. Actually, I did have a paper, but it's been a billion years since I read it. That goes way back. But here's the problem. The problem is with a lot of animal models, depending on where they're at in the species tree, it's going to matter if they have things like, say, cholesterol ester transfer protein, which you're familiar with. But that's also relevant to the energy model because CETP activity couples with lipoprotein lipase activity, and that kind of comes around to like a bit of the load balancing effect. That's outside of tissues. Anyway, sorry, we're
getting too speculative. I just thought the brown bears was a nice tangent. It probably wasn't the strongest thing to end on because it's just a fun fact, more or less. But I'm excited for these data. Casey, you can ground us with some final questions on, maybe what you think would be helpful or functional for people to take away?
Sure.
Tips, tricks, whatever. What came into your mind that you might want to ask about?
Well, that's a great question. I think we talk a lot about how LDL can be harmful. Is it harmful? We need to lower it, whatever. LDL does other things though, right? Isn't it important to for other functions other than heart health?
Yeah, well, and that's also part of what I had in my last talk. I believe that it's actually very important for structure, perhaps much more than is normally looked at. So for example, if you're storing fat, and this may be one of those things that kind of, I guess you could say, has been an upgrade to the energy model and how I think of it now, is that you need to incorporate a lot more phospholipids and free cholesterol. Well, your lipoproteins aren't made, they're monolayer is made of phospholipids and free cholesterol. That's also what the bilayer membranes of your cells are made of, particularly your adipocytes. Your adipocytes need to expand and contract constantly throughout your day, whether you're on a low carb or high fat diet, but I would posit that they have to expand and contract more when your metabolic pathway is fat based, because you literally are making use of the fatty acids in your adipocytes at a higher turnover rate, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So that's just for structure. They have a whole swath of other things associated with the immune response and its engagement. And of course, I've got to pitch my colleague, Siobhan Huggins. She has an excellent article on this at cholesterolcode.com. You can just do a search on immune, and you'll see she's got basically kind of a cool review where she goes through a whole bunch of different studies.
Wow, this has been amazing, boys. I have learned so much from both of you. I would love to ask, I know we need to wrap this up, each one of you, what's one simple tip you'd leave for the listener?
Dave, you go first.
My overall, just period, is stay curious. Every time I think I've got something figured out, I find a lot of times I have to tear it apart and then come back to it again. While we've talked about some of the things that have been persistent, like with the energy model, there are many other things, like proteins, for example, that I had misconceptions on, thought that I had it figured out, that I would then find I need to, completely replace. And that may truly apply to the energy model in time. It could be that there are things about it that are foundationally wrong. And I hope that I can be open-minded enough to catch it. Mm-hmm. But the smartest people I know to this day tend to be the most curious. They tend to be the people who are still like pulling at the threads everywhere around them. Oh. So that's my only 2 cents. That the one, and to say the converse of that, we were talking about this earlier, Nick. While I don't want to paint with a broad brush, there are too many people sometimes in the nutrition space who I think talk as though they do have it all figured out. There's not really a lot more purpose for them to be curious because they can give you the Cliff's Notes version of what you should do. That's what I'm skeptical of, for that matter.
Yeah.
Great answer.
Well, I'll build on that then, on the curious piece, because this is something I say a lot, is that, don't undervalue your experience, and, be curious about what's going on in you and your N=1 experiment. So that's a term we said probably a couple times, but N=1 refers to the number of participants in a study, which is in this case 1. So your N=1 life is the lifelong study that is going on in your body at all times in your life. So, when you eat a certain food or take a certain drug and feel a certain way, don't undervalue that, because no matter what the literature says, you are an individual. So nobody can really tell you what is best for you except a curious and informed you. So if you get informed and you stay curious, I think that's the formula for better health, because you're always going to be tweaking and improving in yourself. So like if you imagine a period of data quality, I would put maybe epidemiology kind of goes to the bottom for generating hypotheses. Randomized controlled trials, they're near the top, but they're not the top. The tip of the pyramid is your N=1 life. So I always think people reserve the right to tell anybody like coming at them with data, if this is working for them, to like, go off and have fun with your data. So if I say something about ketogenic diets being awesome and you have to go high fat, low carb, and you're someone who's living a super healthy life by your markers, how you feel on a low fat, high carb vegan diet, and it's working for you, then you can tell me like, you just talk your mouth out, Nick, I'm not listening. You don't have a right to tell me what to do. And I genuinely believe that, that we're all pretty individual and people have to figure out what works for them, but be honest with yourself about if you think this is your optimal or if you could improve. And my personal opinion is we're always asymptotically approaching perfection. If you can get that mindset that I can use food to always tweak and improve myself. And this isn't a chore. Nutrition is not a chore, but it's a journey. It's exciting. It's fun. I get to play and optimize myself in addition to just enjoying the food that I eat. I think that's a mindset for being happy and successful in your food and lifestyle. So that was a little bit rambly, but I think that it bounces nicely off of Dave's curiosity bit.
Great answers. Great answers. That's amazing. Dave Feldman, thank you so much for appearing on our show. Where can people go to find you?
Of course, our main site is cholesterolcode.com. That's where a lot of our research is. It's kind of our hub. We would love everyone's support at citizensciencefoundation.org. It's a fully qualified 501c3 charity. That is what's running the study. And it's what's helping us make it happen. And lastly, Own Your Labs is what Siobhan and I are partners on, and that's actually where people can get private labs if they want to order it. But on top of that, you can help citizen science because we also have an opt-in, which we hope you'll take, where you can provide your anonymized data to our citizen science data pool, which we're soon going to be posting, hopefully this summer.
Awesome. We'll link to all of that in the show notes. Dr. Nick Norwitz, you're a great guest and you're also a great host. I think my job might be on the line here. Where would you like people to go to find you and your work?
You can just find me right now on Twitter at Nick Norwitz. I'll probably you can just start there. Awesome. I'm pretty active on Twitter, not much on other social media, awesome. But thank you so much, Casey, for inviting me to do this with you. And I'm excited to have it an ongoing thing. And we'll have to have, if we're still doing this when I'm going through med school, Dave back once some of the data starts to drop, because this was the tip of the iceberg.
Yep.
I think we'll probably both welcome back. We could probably talk for 24 hours straight.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Coffee and probably good.
Well, it was a total honor to host both of you. We really appreciate all of you and all your work, and just so honored to be part of this conversation. So thank you both so much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Casey.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. And this has been another episode of Boundless Body.